Ladies and gentlemen, welcome this morning to what we hope is going to be a great program. It is called The Human Side of the Fiscal Crisis. It is presented by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, an oxymoronic group that keeps trying to kick the football despite Lucy's best efforts in pulling it away. This morning you have seen what the program is, and so I will not get into that too deeply. I merely, first of all, want to say that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is very grateful to the MacArthur Foundation for the funding of this particular project, this paper that has been written by Ann Vorst, and which will be commented on by a group of luminaries, all well known to you. After the moderator has a chance to get in a few words, Ann will present her paper, and you'll have a chance to see what possibilities lurk out there. The idea, I think, is to indicate that there are consequences, not only of taking some action, but perhaps more severe consequences of not taking any action. And you will get a chance to participate, and I hope you enjoy the program. With that, I'd like to move on promptly to Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, who is today's moderator. Ruth?
I can see. Thank you for pointing out how short I am. I can see you. Can you see me? When Ann asked me to moderate this important event, I was really pleased because I think the topic could not be more, obviously more timely, but also more significant, because I think that in a strange way, those of us who care very deeply about the nation's fiscal future have just been outmaneuvered on the message front. And I think you may read this in a future column. I think the whole concept of fiscal hawk is wrong. I think we should think about how we're fiscal pandas. We're cuddly, and we care about the fiscal situation, not because we're raptors who want to swoop down on programs and pluck food out of the mouths of hungry children, but exactly the opposite. We're warm and cuddly, especially those of us who come from a little bit left of the center, and we care about the fiscal picture because we care about preserving the important things that government does. And I think that what Ann's paper shows is, in part, the real-world effects on the different generations of the people that we all care about as Americans and as citizens of the world, really, of simply keeping our heads in the sand. And so I hope that message will start to come forward. Ann probably needs no introduction, but she is the project director of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's Fiscal Roadmap Project, and she has 20 years as a senior economist at the European Commission, at the embassy here in D.C., at the Congressional Research Service, and I'm sorry I didn't bring my guitar to, like some of the contest participants, but I will now, and I don't think Ann brought her guitar either, but she can take over. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Ruth, for your very kind words. I'd like to welcome everyone to our event on the human side of the fiscal crisis. I must say, this event is unusual for us. While our events are always about people, we usually refer to it a bit differently, and it's a lot less obvious when the focus is on debt triggers and pay-go. The original focus on the human side came actually from the MacArthur Foundation, which asked us to write a paper on how our fiscal problems affect the daily lives of the average American in very concrete ways. I will present the conclusions of the paper that I wrote for them in a few minutes. We broadened their idea to this event, but we didn't stop there. We held possibly one of the first fiscal video contests in the country. We invited people to tell the Washington budget experts, I used the word wonks, but was corrected, on how to fix our budget problems in their own words. In a video of 1 to 2 minutes, they were asked to submit an entry to a contest called The Voices of America. People had about a month to come up with a video, and they uploaded it on YouTube. We received creative, thoughtful videos, including an entry from a fellow who has a game show already set up on YouTube called You, like you, Do the U.S. Budget. It's terrific. It has the millionaire game set, and it's really impressive. So we have judged the entries, and I'm delighted today to announce the winners of the contest and to premiere their videos. They may be watching today. The top 2 winners are Daniel Lamoureux from Thornton, Illinois. He's a writer, an editor, and as you'll see, a giant flag owner, as he pointed out. The other top winner is Jessica Levinson from Los Angeles, who is the Director of Political Reform at the Center for Governmental Studies. And we have 2 runners-up. We have Anna Flaherty, originally from New York and Hawaii, who's headed toward either medical school or the music profession. And finally, Christopher Murray, nearby from Frederick, Maryland. He's a financial planner and president of Murray Financial Group since 1994. We have already showed their videos in their entirety before the event, and we'll show them again in a loop at the end. But right now, we'd like to show you a montage we've put together of their videos, just to give you a flavor of the creativity and thoughtfulness all around us.
Hey America, we've got a serious problem in this country, and it's called the budget. It's no fun to talk about, but our government is spending way more money than it's taking in. It's a huge problem, and it affects each and every one of us. How so? Well, see this dollar? Every week your employer gives you a certain number of these. But this dollar is starting to lose value because the national debt is so out of control. And when the dollar loses value, it's like a pay cut for every American. If Congress doesn't do something soon to get the budget under control, it's soon going to take a whole lot more of these to buy the things we need in this country.
So I think our nation's budget problems basically come down to the way we answer 2 questions. The first is, do you want lower taxes? Most people are going to say, absolutely yes. They want to keep more of their paycheck. The second question is, do you want more government services like Social Security and Medicare? Again, most people very rationally say, yes, absolutely. So what's the problem? That fundamentally that's an unsustainable model when we have low revenue and high government spending.
America needs to maintain long-term investments or it will cease to be economically competitive internationally, so what's the solution?
The size of the federal budget is an economic threat to the United States in all ways, short, medium, and long term. It is also a threat to me as a small business owner and family man.
So what's one way we can try and get around that? Well, it's a system called pay-as-you-go. Do you want lower taxes? No problem, then tell us which services you want to cut. Do you want more services, more hours for your library? No problem, just tell us where the money's going to come from.
In the next 5 years, we're going to have to make serious and deep spending cuts in everything, including the Defense Department budget, needs to be on the table. And if somebody tells you that cutting the Defense Department budget is unpatriotic, you tell them that what's really unpatriotic is letting this country go bankrupt.
In closing, the time to act is now. The time for pledges and promises has long passed. The Greeks are thousands of years old. I don't want to be like them when I grow up.
Please join me in a round of applause for our contest winners. Let me turn now to our paper. Today we are releasing our paper, America's Fiscal Choices at a Crossroad, the Human Side of the Fiscal Crisis. There are copies of the executive summary out on the table, just outside the conference room. The full paper will be posted on our website later, and hard copies will be available as well. The paper attempts to bridge the gulf in the national budget conversation between experts like us, and probably most everyone in the room, and the average American sitting around his or her kitchen table. The first questions we try to address in the paper are just what are our challenges, and how important is that we address them urgently? As you all know, there's disagreement in the country over how urgent tackling our problems is. There's disagreement even among some of the country's top economic thinkers. People say we don't need to deal with some of our budget problems for a while. U.S. debt remains safe, secure, interest rates are low, we're the safe haven from the turmoil in the rest of the world. So what's the problem and what's the hurry? But how people answer that question is importantly shaped by the language we use in our national budget conversation, whether in Congress, in expert policy forums, by the media. The language is vague. We talk about longer run challenges, the short run, the long run, the medium term, the near term. To try to lay out our problems with more precision, we plotted a series of key fiscal challenges in a timeline to try to present it in a more human but systematic way. We ended up with what we called America's Fiscal Challenges Timeline, if we could get the slide at some point. Looking at the timeline, which is in the paper as well, you can see the broad sweep of the many challenges facing us over our lifetime. As part of the paper exercise, I created fiscal challenges timelines for all the generations. Although the concept was a bit different, I also did it for some special groups. I did it for the poor and working poor. I did it for business and innovators. They're pretty scary, but they give us a baseline, roughly, on what our challenges are in a continuum. What do we have to do? What tasks are ahead of us? Let me show you an example of, I think it's the next slide. It's the baby boomers fiscal challenges timeline. In the paper, we focus a bit more on a particular age of each generation, just to personalize the discussion even more. So in the baby boom generation and on the timeline, we look at John, 56-year-old, the midpoint of the baby boom generation, and some of the important fiscal challenges he can expect to face in his lifetime. As the timelines help illustrate, we know that a daunting series of fiscal challenges lie ahead, regardless of whether you're a baby boomer, Generation Xer, or child, which we're calling Gen Web. We know roughly what the challenges are and when they will occur, and we have a chance to address them before they get out of hand. We also know that the economy cannot fully recover and then remain strong without addressing these fiscal challenges. And we also know if these problems are left unchecked, we will eventually face a full-blown fiscal crisis, although we don't know when, and we don't know what the tipping point will be. But certainly, we cannot borrow faster than our economy is growing forever. How do we head off trouble, though, without cutting our struggling recovery off, as happened in the 30s? So far, no agreement on what to do and when to do it has emerged. Although the conversation has gotten louder, indeed, despite keen interest in fixing our problems, policymakers may in the end fail to agree to a plan to right our fiscal course over the next few years. The resulting fiscal stalemate would have high costs and risks for the American people. This idea and this thought led us to point number 2 in the paper, a thought experiment. In an attempt to illustrate what's at stake for all Americans in a more human way than the usual fiscal policy literature, we run a thought experiment. Taking a cue from Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, we consider how people's lives might have been different under two alternative but reasonably believable fiscal paths, policy inaction versus action. Scenario 1 is fiscal gridlock. Our political leaders do not change course. Scenario 2 is fiscal recovery plan, a multi-year plan to stabilize and reduce the federal debt as a share of the economy is put in place in the near future, is how we define it. As part of our everyday thought experiment, we look at the lives of all the generations, whether they be better or worse off under each scenario. Let me give you a few of our conclusions. For all generations and all special groups, in a world full of fiscal gridlock, everyone will have a fiscal crisis in their lifetime. That's undeniable if we don't change our policies. Baby boomers. Right now they're trying to maximize savings as they approach retirement. At the same time, they may be supporting their elderly parents and possibly their children, who still may be at home. They will suffer from national debt-related pressures, slowing growth, employment, and income. The millennials, they span the high school, college, and young professional worlds. Now their lives will be shaped by fiscal issues affecting jobs, income, and education. For millennials just starting out in the job world, a weak job market can mean no job. They might have to live off parents or even the government. It might mean a substandard job, which would mean they could have a lower standard of living over the rest of their lives. Children, the Gen Web generation, debt-related effects on growth, including interest rates and other effects, will hurt their parents' jobs and incomes, and so children will be worse off from household pocketbook issues. Looking ahead to their adult years, the children of today can look forward to a sharply lower standard of living from fiscal gridlock. So this is not necessarily good news. Our bottom line, as tough as it will be to fix our fiscal problems, failing to fix them will be even worse. Though we cannot promise that a fiscal fix will be easy or pain-free, making the changes before they're forced on us is far more desirable from the perspective of virtually everyone and the economy as a whole. Ultimately, one way or another, everyone's standard of living in the near future and in 2050 and beyond is at stake. So what might break our national policy stalemate? How we move forward will depend largely on how ordinary people and our leaders see their choices and act upon them. Our paper suggests some conceptual tools for people to think more concretely about their own personal fiscal challenges and how to manage them. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. I think what we're going to do is, rather than have me pop up and down for every speaker, I'm going to introduce each panel three at a time. The panelists will not each be sitting here for a technical reason, which is they'll come up for the discussion, but they'll each present individually, so you're able to see their PowerPoint presentations. I have to have a note of dissent from this, having once written a column about how PowerPoint caused the space shuttle to crash and is destroying all of our minds. And I refuse to let my children have PowerPoint on their computers, but they've found technological ways around that. So I'll introduce the first panel, and then each of you can come up when it's your turn, and then we'll all come back up. Andy Stern is now at the Georgetown University Public Policy Institute, but you probably know him as the former president of the SEIU, where he really was one of the most interesting, visionary, iconoclastic, always fun to hear from, and I'm sure he will be today, union leaders around. He's spent an enormous amount of time thinking about this issue, and particularly thinking about the best way to address it as I know from talking to his colleagues, valuable member of the President's Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, better known as Simpson-Bowles. Lenny Mendonca, our second speaker, I apologize, is a director in the San Francisco office of McKinsey & Company, and he oversees the McKinsey Global Institute, among many other qualifications. He is trustee of the Committee for Economic Development, which does important work in this area as well. And finally, but not least, Derek Thompson, associate editor at one of my favorite magazines, The Atlantic. He writes about economics, business, and technology, and he's also a visiting research fellow, and I'm just going to plug all the groups that I care about at one of my absolute favorites, right here, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. So without further ado, Andy, you're up first.
Great. First of all, I love the videos. Weren't they great, the videos? Yeah. And thanks very much, Ann, for the report. And I will try, in deference to Ruth, to be really quick on my PowerPoint, and start having a withdrawing experience. So let me just say a couple things, so we're not confused, because I think, the wonderful work that a lot of people in this room have done have made it rather clear. Although there may be debates, I'd say the continuum is shrinking. We do face a major financial crisis. Those of us who may have been somewhat skeptical about it as we started on the President's Commission, I think ended up feeling rather extremely more concerned at the end of the process than in the beginning. And I think it's fair to say we all now have a front row seat. We always asked ourselves, how did 9/11 happen? Was it really preventable? Or, how did the financial meltdown happen? And yet, what's a remarkable experience we're all living through together is we are watching day by day, hour by hour, month by month, an impending crisis that when it hits, we'll all wonder, why didn't someone do anything about it? And so I think that's probably more important of a question. And the question of how it's really going to affect people if we don't do something about it, I think has been appropriately said. So I think the only remaining question is, are we going to be proactive or reactive? Are we going to be first movers or first casualties? And any family who understands, who has overdue bills, unpaid mortgages, who has credit cards that are overextended, appreciates either you take action about your situation or other people take actions for you. And the rest of the world, I happen to believe, is preparing to take action for us if we don't take action ourselves. And it does seem, as we watch this discussion unfold, that we may not be capable of taking action until the crisis unfolds. And I think what Ann contributed to this is it's going to be a huge problem. And for those of us who live through and have lived through state fiscal crises, people in the education world, in the healthcare world, who deal with senior citizens, we are watching the laboratory of what happens when we don't take actions, when we spend our rainy day funds, when we make unrealistic assumptions about pension and healthcare plans. Eventually the bill comes due, and the people that get hurt are not necessarily the wealthy, not necessarily the most able to withstand the problems, but it tends to be the kids, the seniors, the parents. States like Illinois, where I think they've eliminated the entire drug and alcohol treatment program in the entire state. So when the problem hits, this is a problem for people that work. It is a problem for people that are poor, as Ann pointed out. And so waiting for the crisis to happen and not taking appropriate action ahead of time has very simple and severe implications for the people that can't afford it the most. So let me just, if this works, be quick. There is general agreement now. This is Larry Michelle and David Walker now with Comeback America initiative, I guess now over a year ago. This is Bob Greenstein, who I think many of us would say is about as responsible a person about not only budget, but about what the impacts are on poor and working class people's outline of how, as Ann said, who's going to suffer the most when we have a budget crisis? It is going to be the people who can afford it the least. I just want to say three things about the crisis so that we keep it in focus, at least from my perspective. One is, this was a chart, I forget who did it, that was pretty interesting because this just shows how you can manipulate facts to get different impressions or make charts to get different impressions. Here's one that sort of makes you feel like the whole world is out of control and rising. But if you really rearrange the chart a little bit, you really begin to say that the real problem we have here is health care and the interest on the debt. And so getting control of our fiscal situation is not just getting control of our health care spending, which is the most important thing. And as you can see, Social Security is really not a contributor to the problem, at least the debt problem. It's just a pension fund out of balance that we have to get back in balance, as you do with all pension plans. But the rising net interest cost that was just accelerated by virtue of the decisions we made about the Bush tax cuts, is really a growing problem. and growing as a result significantly of the Medicare and Medicaid challenges we face, particularly in the out years, which is why everybody keeps appropriately saying that focusing on the 12% of the budget that's discretionary spending is really kind of an interesting, exercise, but really has no long-term fiscal effect and won't solve the problems Ann's been talking about earlier. Let me just say my favorite issue happens to be the Defense Department. I don't think we can spend as much money as the rest of the world combined on defense. I wrote a column recently called From Russia with Love on Valentine's Day, which was really just an explanation of how Russia really collapsed economically from within. And despite all of its attempts to defend itself militarily, it was really its failure to defend itself economically that had led to the ultimate downfall, along with some other factors. And I also go on to say that clearly everyone from Tom Coburn on believes that there's an enormous amount of waste in the military, but there's an enormous increase that we've had in spending. And when you couple that with all the increased spending as a result of Homeland Security after 9/11, we are not going to have defense be our largest export product. We cannot have defense be our jobs program. This is something that, if we don't get under control, has huge implications, and America can't afford to spend as much as the rest of the world combined. I think the Simpson-Bowles Commission did a wonderful job pointing out a number of things that we now call tax spending or tax expenditures, something I saw that Senator Schumer is beginning to look at today, this morning, in terms of sort of expanding the reach of the Democrats in the budget crisis. But we need to understand that we forego more revenues from tax expenditures than we actually take in personal income tax paid. So we have three big areas that we need to deal with: healthcare, tax expenditures, don't need to do that, and defense. I think Ann laid out the implications. If we don't, doing nothing is not really an option, because someone is going to do something, and we are either first movers or first casualties. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. I'll be brief so we can get to the panel. And Ruth, you'll be happy to know that I'm not going to use any PowerPoints. I want to make an additional point or two about the urgency of dealing with our fiscal crisis and add one other element to it, which is that in addition to dealing with the near-term challenges of expenditures in excess of revenues, the only way we're really going to get out of this issue in the longer term is to have a dramatic increase in the productivity rate of growth of the U.S. economy as a whole. Largely because of the demography of the country and a declining growth in the labor force, we're going to have something like a third increase in our productivity growth rate just to be able to sustain the level of GDP growth we've had for the last while. And that's going to require something like a 2.5% increase per year in productivity, a level that we haven't seen since the 1960s. That's a huge challenge, but we think, from doing some work more broadly that we just released at the McKinsey Global Institute on growth and renewal in the United States, that is possible. And it doesn't require massive new technological change. It really requires organizing ourselves better and improving what we do to best practice. That's particularly acute in the public sector. We cannot have a dual-speed economy where the private sector is increasing productivity because of the increase in competitive pressure and global competition, and the public sector continues to drag behind. So in addition to having fiscal discipline, we're going to have to ensure that we release 4 anchors holding back the U.S. economy. In those are healthcare, education, energy efficiency, and infrastructure more generally, and public sector administration. In 2008, the U.S. spent $2.3 trillion on healthcare, more than we spend on food and more than the Chinese spend on everything. Adjusted for population and income, we spend $650 billion a year, more than any other OECD country, and that's growing in terms of its relative position. We need to eliminate the drag of lack of growth of productivity in the healthcare sector. Secondly, persistent gap in achievement between children here and other countries deprives the U.S. economy of substantial economic output. Had we closed the performance gap between low-income students and those better off in 2008, our estimate is that GDP that year would have been greater by $400 to $700 billion, the equivalent of a permanent national recession because of our achievement gap and lack of performance in the education system. Third, we are going to have to do something about energy efficiency. Holding aside debates about climate change and carbon, which are extraordinarily important, our estimates are that increasing the basic energy equipment and efficiency of the U.S. could generate a present value of in excess of $200 billion a year. And these are largely because of energy market failures that discourage consumers and businesses from embracing energy productivity. And lastly, the public sector is, by most estimates, several years, if not a decade, behind the managerial practices of much of the private sector. And as Amanda Ripley said in a Time magazine article this year, that's the equivalent of a stimulus every 2 or 3 years. Our estimate is that by halving the difference between the private sector and public sector performance in administrative functions, leaving aside defense and healthcare and education, we could generate as much as $200 billion a year in extra available resource for the country. So in addition to dealing with the near-term challenges of expenditures in excess of revenues, we are going to have a massive increase in productivity. It's going to have to happen in the private sector, but importantly, it's going to have to happen in the public sector as well, particularly in these 4 anchors that have not seen the same productivity revolution that much of the rest of the economy has. Look forward to talking about this in a little bit.
Hi, I'm Derek Thompson, Associate Editor with The Atlantic, and I want to thank Anne for writing this important paper and for New America for having me. I want to talk a little bit about frames. As an economic writer for a generalist publication, I spent a lot of time trying to find new, clear-eyed, well-lit ways to describe complex economic policies to average people, so I want to talk about some of them and which ones make sense and which ones don't. First, since I'm paid to read and write all day about economic policy, I tend to see a lot of the same sentences come up. And one of the ones that comes up quite a bit is that it's time to have an adult conversation about the deficit. I'm sure you've heard this. You have to almost go out of your way not to hear this sentence on Sunday talk shows. And while I think it's true that it's important not to have a conversation about the debt that resembles an infant, it's an imprecise slogan. It's the right words, I think, in the wrong order. We need to have an adult conversation. But more importantly, we need to have a conversation about adults. What does this mean? First, a conversation about adults means that by the numbers, deficit reduction is about promises we've made to adults that we have to change. For the last 50 years, as Andy, I think, said very, very well, with every passing decade, we've said you can pay fewer taxes and expect higher benefits, and that's not sustainable. Second, a conversation about adults means that budget surgery isn't just about making the numbers work, it's about making the numbers work for us, for people. Deficit reduction, I think, as Anne really puts a beautiful fine point on, is about human beings. It's about asking questions like, how can the economy make us more productive? Or what is the best way to promote smart retirement, as I think Andy's about to go into later in our talk. And is it possible to restore the middle class's buying power while at the same time potentially raising effective tax rates on the average American? These aren't questions about accounting explicitly. They're also questions about our lives. And it's important for us to make these complicated issues accessible to people. So to talk a little bit about frames, first of all, I love the idea of fiscal pandaism. Second, I think that Washington in general just doesn't do that well with framing the deficit. First, you have the obvious complaints about the U.S. operating its deficit debate within the confines of non-security, non-innovation, discretionary spending, as we're seeing debt reduction debated right now on Capitol Hill. This is obviously ridiculous. It's sort of like going to the dentist and having him saying you have a problem with your dental hygiene, and then going back and saying, well, I bought a toothbrush and I've been scrubbing the same tooth every single day for the last 6 months. It's true that tooth is going to be extremely healthy, maybe even too healthy. You'll wear out the enamel if you brush too much. But it also doesn't make any sense to think about dental hygiene by just brushing one tooth. But that's sort of how we're thinking about deficit policy. We're thinking if we scrub non-security, non-innovation discretionary spending the right amount, we'll somehow get on our way to getting a fiscal framework that makes sense, and that doesn't seem to follow. Also, you have the White House saying things like, families across the country are tightening their belts, and that means it's time for the United States to do the same. that the parallelism sounds about right, but it's actually totally wrong. We're running a huge deficit. The United States government is obviously not tightening its belt, and it shouldn't. When families tighten their belts, spending falls, demand falls, employment falls, and that means that the government spending automatically increases on Medicaid and unemployment benefits. So really, when families tighten their belt by a notch, government expands its belt by a notch. That's how this country works. That's how income security works. And we need to explain it better. And so 2 frames really quickly that I think would be more helpful is to think of deficits as medicine and to think of deficit reduction as insurance. The idea of deficits as medicine is the idea that deficits aren't inherently bad, the way that strong prescription drugs aren't inherently bad. But you can abuse prescription drugs. Charlie Sheen comes to mind. And so it's important to think about short-term, long-term usage when we talk about deficits and debt. And second, the idea of debt reduction as insurance is an idea that I sort of played around with on the blog. Especially in progressive circles, you see the idea of debt reduction being criticized, but at the same time, they're excited about the idea of a carbon tax, which I am for, as insurance against the likelihood that we'll have global warming have horrible effects. And I think to a certain extent that's what debt reduction is. It's insurance against the likelihood that in the next 10, 15 years we're going to have a serious fiscal crisis that's brought about because we didn't act now. I just wanted to go into one question that is brought up a lot and that I sort of wanted to anticipate, which is that with unemployment right now at 9%, why are we focusing on the deficit? And more importantly, if, as Andy showed in his charts, the problem is entirely in the long run in healthcare, in Medicare and Medicaid, why are we talking about discretionary spending? To the issue of healthcare, I think healthcare inflation is sort of like the Greek story of the Gordian knot. Nobody knew how to untie it, and then Alexander the Great came along and he cut it in half with a sword. And he said, well, I solved it. Right now, we don't know how to untie the Gordian knot of healthcare inflation. What we do have is answers like Paul Ryan, which is an answer, but he's essentially saying let's voucherize the program, let's slice the knot in half, and that will solve the problem. But really, we don't know how to untangle the knot. And so in the short term, we need to pay this down payment on insurance against the possibility of debt, of a debt crisis happening, by cutting and reforming where we know how to cut and reform. And that means small, gradual changes in discretionary spending, in taxes, potentially even in Social Security. Lastly, I just wanted to talk briefly about productivity because I think it's a really important issue. The idea that you can't just get out of a debt crisis by cutting, you also have to get out of a debt crisis by growing. The 3 building blocks that I see of productivity are infrastructure, education, and research and development spending. Since the 1950s, infrastructure spending as a share of GDP has declined 80%. In 1970, in education, the total U.S. spending in education was twice that of healthcare. In 10 years, total education spending on healthcare will be twice that of education. And in R&D spending, in the last 50 years, R&D has fallen far below 1950s levels in research and development. The private sector has helped to pick up the slack a bit on this, but it's important that we continue to invest in innovative policies so that wages continue to grow. Lastly, I like sometimes thinking about what the business of America is and what the role of government should be in our lives since we're a rich and aging country. And it's interesting because if you look at welfare, benefits to retirees, and healthcare payments, they account for 62% of the budget. Welfare, benefits to retirees, and healthcare spending. And yet yet when you poll average Americans, sometimes they say that we can fix the federal budget by focusing on foreign aid. If the U.S. deficit were the U.S. population, the components I just named, welfare, benefits for retirees, and healthcare, would be California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, New Jersey, Virginia, and Houston. And foreign aid would be Houston. So it's important to keep these ideas in perspective, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
So those were 3 really fascinating and relatively PowerPoint-free presentations. Thank you. It's interesting, the question about the adult conversation. I've been thinking about whether we need to actually have more of a toddler-like conversation, because toddlers seem to understand that there's, a limited number of cookies to go around, and, the essential thing they learn in preschool is the need to share them, but we'll play around with that. And, the concept of deficit reduction as insurance, it's like insurance when you're living in the flood zone, right? I think that's just to tweak your analogy.
I accept.
Yeah. There's so many rich things to talk about, and I think given that there's so many people in the audience who have terrific background and insights on this issue, I'm going to want to open it up for questions really quickly. But I guess we should probably start with one of the things that everybody mentioned, which is health care. The issue of health care spending, Derek, you said Gordy and not, it's like the weather, right? Everybody talks about the need to deal with health care spending, and nobody really does a very good job, other than, okay, we'll voucherize it, of talking about what we need to do to address it. So, Lenny, let me start with you and ask, since you talked about it as a necessary change in order to free up our productivity and spur economic growth, what can be done, and are we talking about changes that need to take place over very long terms, or are there things that can be changed over the near term so that people could sort of, both to get people an understanding that this is critical and to show them the effect? Are there short-term fixes?
Well, we could have an entire seminar on healthcare costs and what's the challenge, and we had a 2-year-long debate in the country about healthcare, and we talked mostly about access and didn't really talk about bending the curve very much. And so the Affordable Care Act had at least part of the equation of extending access and coverage, but we really need to have a substantial conversation about quality, effectiveness, and cost. Some of those things are near-term. Many of them are slightly longer-term efforts. There is no silver bullet to this. The challenge with healthcare costs is that it's peanut buttered across the entire system. It's not simply about eliminating administrative expense or drug costs. It's actually in the delivery system itself. We have a substantial excess cost in how we provide care and how much of it we provide to all citizens. And you can't solve this just by saying, cut this or put price caps in, or go to some other payment system so that we eliminate administrative costs. It's really about aligning incentives so that what is best practice in healthcare is common practice. That's a challenging effort, but it's a conversation that we really are going to have about improving the transparency of what we're getting for our money, aligning the incentives to that, and ensuring that the payment mechanisms that incent doctors and patients to make decisions are actually aligned around what it costs, not just the availability of care.
And Andy, I know one of the most disappointing for me aspects of the commission was that it was unable to get the votes of any of the House Republicans who served. I'm told that wasn't because they did the terrible step of being willing to raise revenue, because we've now entered a world where Tom Coburn is willing to say we cannot simply cut our way out of this, but because they were unhappy with the approaches on healthcare. Do you see and I don't want to focus just on healthcare, but it was just striking that everybody was, it's obviously such a central challenge. Do you see a way to cut the Gordian knot on healthcare?
Well, first of all, we're coming up to our first-year anniversary of the Health Care Act. Interestingly enough, the Republican pledge that they issued was issued on the day that actually all the good things in healthcare actually happened. They kind of did a very effective job about, kids staying on until you're 26, no pre-existing conditions. So I think here's what happened with healthcare. I appreciate the Republicans' irrational objection to this, but I think, as Joe Biden said, it was a big, I'll leave the word out, deal of what we did, because we did three things. One is we built a system. Up to this point in time, we didn't have a system. You can't have a system without IT, you can't have a system without everyone in, and you can't have a system without information transparency. So we built a system. We're beginning to work on that system in terms of productivity, looking at outcomes, looking at a series of changes that needed to be made in any system we have. And we're moving to the final question. And there is only one final question, I happen to believe. It's, do you believe, Paul Ryan, that if we voucherize the system, cap the amount of money spent, the market will respond and we will cut healthcare costs? I don't. Or do you look what almost every business in the world would do if they looked around at all their competitors in countries who were spending 5 to 7% less than they were, they would say, let's go to France and find out what they're doing there to keep their healthcare costs down, or many of the studies McKinsey have done about doctors' costs and others, and they would say, let's just do it. I think healthcare is actually very easy. Countries around the world spend 5 to 7% less and get a better result. So we have a huge productivity gain to be captured simply by adopting what other people have done, and I don't think what Paul Ryan does works.
Great. Derek?
I just really wanted to say quickly, I'm going to steal actually from the paper that MGI released on productivity a few weeks ago. And it's interesting, in the past decades, productivity has grown the most where employment has grown. But right now, employment's projected to grow fastest in healthcare, and that's where productivity is slowest. And so for the first time in a long time, it's very strange that we're seeing employment scheduled to grow fastest in the sector that's having the hardest time coming up with productivity. And in fact, the converse is true too, that unfortunately productivity is growing fastest in some of the sectors that are where employment is declining, like manufacturing and IT. Also, I think it's just important to point out that healthcare isn't just a federal government problem. It's a state government problem. 30% of state government spending goes to Medicaid. And it's a human problem. Someone has to pay. We have to find some way to reduce healthcare costs because there's a certain receipt that comes with paying for your healthcare, and someone's going to pick it up. Either your family's going to pick it up or the government's going to pick it up. And so if we don't find a way to reform the system, not just the way we pay for it, whether it's vouchers or fee-for-service, but reform the system, then we're all in trouble, not just the federal government.
Great. Well, I should ask first if anybody on the panel wanted to react to something that anybody else on the panel had to say in the non-healthcare field. And if not, are there questions for the panel? In the way back of the room, the gentleman on my right, your left.
My name's Dan Lieberman. I'm not a professional economist, but I know something about economy. I just wondering if we don't have the thing a little backwards, that the deficit is not the problem, but the result of a greater problem. And there are two things. Taxes don't create, are not related to deficit. Taxes are only related to government spending. It's what one person said at the beginning. The public has to decide that they want to benefit themselves or that they want more taxes to benefit others. And taxes are quite low now, and that's a separate problem. That's just a problem of government spending. But deficits comes about of a lack of purchasing power in the system. You have all of these goods produced, and there's a certain GNP of goods produced. That has to equal the purchasing power. But the purchasing power has been lessened. First of all, the banks are holding money, not lending them out. Corporations are holding money and not making capital investment. But the biggest thing of all is the current account deficit, which is running $500 billion. If you add all these up, if the government does not run a deficit and put the money back into the economy would go down like a rock. It would have a huge depression. So the deficit is really related mainly to the current account deficit. In other words, you cannot cure the government deficit unless you cure the current account deficit, and that's related to the imports. So you either got to have new industries that compete with the imports or do something to lower the inputs. That's up to the public. So I'm just posing, is the deficit really the problem, or is it a result of the problem? Like if you cut defense industry, well, you cut jobs. you cut employment, you cut production.
Okay.
So what I'm saying, again, is the deficit, can you look at the deficit problem, or do you have to cure these other problems before you look at the deficit?
Well, I mean, I think Derek spoke to a piece of the way we talk about the deficit and the role of the deficit as not necessarily a bad thing in the short run. And I love the toothbrush analogy, by the way, for the debate we're having now. Does anybody want to talk about the sort of the role of globalization, which was a piece of the question, in America's fiscal future?
I'll talk really quickly about exports. I think you're right to put a focus on it. Financial crises like the one we've gone through tend to be cured by export-driven growth. And right now, one of the problems that everybody's trying to juice their exports, and it's difficult for the U.S. to make a lot of headway there. Also, since we import so much of our petroleum, so much of our energy from overseas, that's such a huge part of our trade deficit, and you really have to fix our energy crisis if you're going to fix that. But I think the White House rightly has a strong focus on juicing exports in any way possible, and you've seen a lot of innovation there.
Just because I liked all of Derek's frames, I just want to add one to my to this discussion. So I happen to think that this is a uniquely different moment in world history than anyone has ever experienced. This is the third economic revolution, and where the agricultural took 3,000 years and the industrial took 300 years, this is a 30-year revolution that no single generation of people have ever witnessed before. And so every time we sort of reach back to look at what happened before, I think we have to be very careful, because I don't think we're at a moment that's very similar. And then sort of juicing up exports and things that sort of sounded easier in the 20th century are a lot more complicated in the 21st. Let me just say three other provocative things. So one is, I am not a great believer in the education is the answer school. I happen to think education is enormously important. Everyone should have as much as they can get. But the truth is, the job creation that's occurring in this country, other than targeted places where we do need some more engineers and scientists, is not about increasing education. And I think productivity and a lot of things are being driven by technology, and that education is an overrated answer to a very complex jobs problem we have in our country. Two is, I believe productivity is enormously important. I think much more important is the fact we had a jobless decade, and the gap between the rich and the rest of the population is growing wider every day. So we have a distribution problem as well as a growth problem. And I think the country, I think Barack Obama was incredibly thoughtful when he got elected, when he said, we're going to measure the country not by GDP growth, but by middle class growth. And the problem is we're having middle class loss.
Sir. Right there in the third row. Oh, yes.
All the panelists skipped over a very fundamental axiom of all system science, including biology, social sciences, and military warfighting doctrine, and that is that the most important aspect of any group is the ability to organize and to mobilize. And when we have a growing population every year, we have to mobilize on a greater scale. Given that, the most important building block you can ever talk about, there's an endless hierarchy of them, but the most important one is that ability to mobilize. And when you go down that scale, a fiat currency and even the size of government are both tools, tactics. They are not goals. So this discussion, why aren't we talking about things the United States population could achieve and then leave it as a goal and leave it up to the population to decide how they want to use their tools to achieve that? That's one of the famous sayings that came out of World War II, of all things. Never tell people how to do things, just give them goals to achieve and let them decide how to do it.
Does anybody want to tackle that?
Go ahead. I mean, I would just say, because we don't share goals in this country. We don't have any shared belief of what we can't decide if we're into pay-go, which I think is a terribly destructive process to try to reach a very thoughtful goal, because in order to get money for investment in this country, you have to hurt someone else to grab their dollar to invest in your thing. And so where his intention was good, the result has been we have much less infrastructure spending, much less investment, no money for capital expenditures in this country. So To me, we don't have a plan. And I think this is my last point about the third economic revolution. In the third economic revolution, countries are teams. And U.S. is competing as a team. And Team USA has no plan. China has a plan. Singapore has a plan. Germany has a plan about where they invest, how they train, what they do to build a growth economy. So I agree with you, we need to mobilize, but if everybody's mobilizing in a different direction, it's rather chaotic.
Just really quickly, I think that's absolutely right. What we just saw with the Fiscal Commission is 20 people going into a room agreeing on the goal and totally disagreeing on the way to get there. It's very possible to share goals and totally disagree on the method of getting there.
Right, and actually I would go even further because I actually thought in many ways the Fiscal Commission performed much, much better than I had anticipated, though I'm very cynical and therefore start with a very low baseline of expectations. America can't be a team if Americans don't understand the elements of the game. And so one of the results from polling that really sticks in my mind is the concept that 75% of people polled believe that you can balance the budget simply by getting waste, fraud, and abuse out of the government. Now, what you said was very intriguing. There was an interesting Government Accountability Office report about government performance, and that would be worth talking more about. But that's just lunacy, okay? We're not going to get to fiscal sustainability that way. Another 75% of Americans believe that you can balance the budget and not touch Social Security and Medicare. Also lunacy. And there, if you sort of go the 75%, there's an overlap there. And so Americans, one thing that I thought was very powerful and important about the commission and about the other parallel efforts was to start at least putting in place a common set of understandings so that Team America could go forward. And I think in a sense, and I'd like to get us a little bit back to the fundamental topic that we're talking about, which is not just the parameters of what needs to be done and the magnitude of what needs to be done and the impossibility of doing it in the sort of cheap and relatively cheap and relatively easy ways that people talk about, or the more difficult ways, but that still would be inadequate, but to talk about the real life impact on Americans and America today of doing nothing. And so maybe we can elaborate a little bit more on some of the things we talked about in the presentations.
I add a couple of things to that to try and square a little bit of that circle. One of the reasons we can't have goals is we actually don't have a common fact-based, let alone a common understanding of where we are today. So let me give you two examples which may sound technical, but I think they're important. One is we actually don't measure government productivity at all. In national accounting, government input equals government output. So if you don't know what's working, what's not working, can have a conversation about what is growing, what's not growing, is it getting less effective, more effective? There's no way you're going to have a real conversation about what do we want that to be. Secondly, the government doesn't differentiate in general between spending and investments. We don't have a capital budget. We don't have a way to differentiate between what is legitimately near-term expense, what is waste, fraud, and abuse, and what is an investment. And how do we think about those and capitalize them properly? And we have to have those kinds of conversations. The last thing I'd say that's less technical, which is that I have more faith in the American population that believes that there is a lot more that government can do better. The language that they use to describe it of simple waste, fraud, and abuse is hackneyed and not particularly realistic. But what Americans are telling us is that I don't want to pay more taxes, nor do I want to have things that I value cut. And that's not just as simple as selfishness. It's about a sense that government is not working as well as it should. And that's partly because they see other things that are working and say, why can't government work like that? And so while it's true that we're not going to close the deficit in 1 year with simple waste, fraud, and abuse or cutting things that everybody agrees we should cut or simple measures, Actually, a 1% increase in productivity over a decade would close the deficit. So the difference between not having productivity growth in the public sector and having productivity growth is essential to the long-run performance of the economy. And we have to get real facts and transparency about what's going on there and talk about what's working and what's not working, get rid of the things that aren't working and invest more in the things that are working.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. All right. They're the lady in the middle of the group. That's my cell phone that I forgot to turn off. I really apologize. I just have to fess up.
Thank you. I want to agree with everything you said, Marcus. What's working and what's not working, and I think as someone who's now retired and who attended that Fiscal Commission kickoff the other day, I think it's the inability of, one, our elected officials on the Hill to get together. How do we do that? How do we get more of them to say, send the message? First, I will, I remember growing up, do as I say, not as I do. What they have to lead the way and say, okay, we're going to take some cuts. Social Security is not going away. Medicare and the entitlement programs need some help or whatever. And the American people, I believe, what works and doesn't work, need to be well educated and not get the talking points from all the elected officials, from all the union groups, from every lobbyist in town, and scares them. And we have to go back to the wants and the needs, and also have to look at can we afford it and be willing to take this. I think that Fiscal Commission that Obama's has some really good stuff coming out of it. But will the politicians who want to be reelected buy into it? Are the American people ready to say, we need to make cuts at the government level, and the elected officials have to take the first step? And are people who are making lots of money who leave government, Mr. Stern, I know you did well in the union, you moved over, you had a good pension, good retirement, everybody else up there. But I think an education to the American people, we're hurting right now. So what are you willing to give up? And what did NAFTA and GATT and those treaties, how did that impact the American job sector and the employment sector? I've worked in healthcare, so I can tell you this healthcare plan is not good. Thank you.
A lot of different pieces there, but does somebody want to jump in? And maybe particularly it would be derelict of me as a reporter to not have Andy Stern here and not talk a little bit about what you took away from the commission process in terms of whether you think the political system is capable and ready to really do something serious.
I mean, I like you, thought the commission worked well better than I ever expected. I happen to think Erskine Bowles is a fabulously competent chairperson who did a very good job sort of sequencing the discussions in ways that everybody felt heard and sort of had their issues dealt with, and came to, I'd say, some very important conclusions that set the stage. I would say that in terms of Derek's framing analogy, we created this country with a legitimate fear about the concentration power in the hands of a king, and we structured a society that diffused power and decision-making, and not only between three portions of government, but between a state and a federal sector. And we've gotten exactly what we asked for, which was no one can make a decision because no one has any power, and we don't have a parliamentary system or a benevolent despot in Singapore or a king. So, we have a structural system design problem that we got what we asked to do. And now we have, I would say, what someone once called demosclerosis, which is a theory that pluralism was supposed to believe everyone worried about their own interest, we'd find the common interest. And the truth is, when everybody worries about their own interest, they worry about their own interest. And you can walk up and down K Street and see all the interests that are worrying about everything. And we cannot move right now because everything is locked down by someone in some way. And that's what I meant. And PAYGO is the worst way to try to unlock it because it just sicks all those interest groups against each other. So I think the only way America has moved in the last decade is usually by great leadership or great crisis, more by the great crisis than the great leadership. I always say if you want to get Congress to move, you have to get their back against the wall, so build the wall that their back is against, because it's the only way to get something done. So I think there's a certain amount of hope that people now believe there's a problem, they know they need to act, that the Fiscal Commission did a terrific job framing some of the places that action needs to be taken. But I think our political system is bereft of an ability to act in an expeditious fashion without a crisis.
Wow. Okay.
No, can I turn that into something that is not absolving citizens from this responsibility as well? We have a representative democracy, but there's a democracy part of that as well, which is we have to hold our elected officials accountable in ways that these things have to be resolved. You know, the Tea Party movement was a first realm at that. You can describe it in all kinds of different ways, but one of those was an extreme frustration with anger about what's going on. I personally have more confidence that well-intentioned small groups who come together and come to resolution can come up with solutions. The Fiscal Commission had a wide range of opinions, but you put a group of people together and say, let's have a discussion about it. At the end of it, we have to come up with something. They came up with something. Nobody liked everything. Same thing happens in deliberative polling technologies. The same things happen in citizen assemblies. They just have no consequences of it when they're done. So I like the back against the wall analogy. If the Fiscal Commission had the equivalent of the Base Closure Commission, that whatever you came up with had to be voted on, we would be having a very different discussion right now.
Well, we tried to get that.
I know.
And we almost, I think the Fiscal Commission got closer than anybody anticipated, and closer probably even than has really been publicly reported.
So I'd say one more thing. The answer then, because I happen to agree with Lenny, that the answer then is, if you want to resolve this budget crisis, put a time bomb at the end of the process that we are going to fund the government to the end of the year, and at a certain date, certain things begin to happen about across-the-board cuts, revenue increases, whatever, and we might solve the problem.
Right, but I mean, the fundamental question that you both have raised, and Derek, jump in after this, is how do you build a wall, right? And how do you build a wall that does not come tumbling down on you? Because when I've talked to people in the administration about where they think things are heading, a lot of times I get the sense that there's a belief that they don't think for the reasons that Andy sort of depressingly and eloquently explained, they don't believe anything can happen really absent a crisis, and their best hope is for a crisis that is contained and containable, and whether that is possible to do, or whether a crisis just starts roiling and is even more destructive than the financial meltdown that we just went through, it seems to me to be an open question. So let's talk a little bit about how to build a wall.
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the difficulties of building the wall, at least for Washington describing how the wall should be built, is that what we're essentially saying is quickly solve this problem, act slowly, phase in solutions gradually. It's a faster, slower sort of thing that's very confusing. I mean, it's sort of like, sure, another metaphor, fine. It's sort of like
you're doing very well in the metaphors.
It's sort of like bomb diffusing, like a bomb diffuser in the Hurt Locker, he has to act very slowly and methodically, but he also has to act very quickly. And so it's difficult to convince average Americans who, for totally good reasons, don't spend their Thursday afternoons reading CBO reports, that we have a huge problem, and it's incredibly dire, but we also have to act very slowly so that we phase in, for instance, in the Fiscal Commission, Social Security changes so that we only reduce typical benefits by 9% by 2050 when, Justin Bieber will be 55 and Mark Zuckerberg will be collecting early Social Security. This is incredible. This is a really long time frame, but we're talking about the crisis happening in the short term. So it's a difficult frame to convince people. It's a difficult sort of crisis to explain.
Anybody have any expertise in wall building?
Well, I mean, I do think, whether it's base closing, which probably won't happen, I think, people who want to get something done, and I don't think this is the way we should do it, but have a real opportunity here to, using the bomb to light the fuse, right, on an explosion that's going to occur, and everybody has enough time to run to it, work on it slowly, but knowing there is an explosion if I don't get to it quickly enough.
Sir, in the third row. And then I promise I'll get to the back of the room because I can see you back there.
Charlton, freelance correspondent, Bethesda Manor. as to adult conversation. I'm thinking about the kids' adult conversation. We try to take the human side of the fiscal crisis as citizenship literacy, and we give the K to 12 and college student the education. And also, I suggest Washington Post. Weekend you have a kids column. Maybe put this in kids column. So we try to get the kids to the adult. I think this is very effective. Thank you.
Can I comment on that and relate it to a question that was earlier, which is, I do think we would benefit from a children's movement, where we have kids who are going to be bearing the cost of our inability to deal with this problem, taking charge and being more of a voice and engaging. And the more we create a education system at K to 12 that's not working, we limit the choices that folks have for higher education and increase the fees to do those, the more anger there is on campuses. And I think it would actually be very constructive to have a children's movement to alter the voice of what's happening in a lot of ways.
That leads us to John, who's you can lead the children's movement, John, in your next career.
We look on them as future members, but I do think that many of the points here are valid, but they were also valid 12 years ago. And I've been around a while. I can remember deficit reduction initiatives that were successful under President Reagan, under President Bush, under President Clinton. We actually had a surplus 12 years ago. And so many of these long-term systematic issues are still with us, I agree. But what's changed in 12 years? I don't think it's the attitudes of the public. I don't think it's some of this other stuff. I think we have to be clear about what's different now and why we feel the urgency now when 12 years ago we had a surplus.
Just to talk quickly about the history of deficit reduction, I think if you're a politician on Capitol Hill looking back to the last 20 years and trying to learn lessons, the lesson you're going to take away is that deficit reduction is a really great way to not keep your job in 2 years. Walter Mondale said the deficit reduction was going to be his prime focus. He said, I will raise taxes. I just told you. So will Ronald Reagan. He won't tell you some form of that sentence. And he got walloped. Clinton got walloped in the midterm elections after his deficit reduction. George Bush raised taxes after asking Americans to read his lips. He lost as well. The lessons that politicians are going to learn from those examples is that deficit reduction is not a smart way to keep your job. And so it's a difficult sort of hyperbolic discounting, asking people to accept a little bit of pain now to delay pain later. This is not the stuff that campaign slogans are built on. Vegetables now, slightly sweeter, candy later. It's just that's not how it's done.
I think there are two lessons that I would take away that are not yet captured. One is the eat your vegetables later and promise to eat them now, which is the equivalent of having a wall that says we are going to commit, but we're going to commit that if it's not resolved by this point, then we're going to eat nothing but broccoli for 5 years. That's one lesson. The second lesson that started in the question around, do we going to do something about deficit, by saying what programs that everyone likes are you going to cut, or what taxes that no one likes are you going to raise, is a non-starter. We have to have a different conversation about how are we going to do that. And I don't think that we've had the real conversation about make government work. What is it about performance that you don't understand? This is how every other institution in the world survives through time. They perform better, and they perform better consistently. I think there is an opportunity for a new conversation about let's look at what is working and make that the norm.
And I would just add, I just want to say, I do think, John, we are in a very different economy than we were before. Globalization, we don't have American companies, we have multinational companies. We don't make things just here, we import them from China. We, have a pension and retirement system that's based on employer basis, and people have 9 to 12 jobs by the time they're 35. So we have all these legacy military institutions and other things trying to build a competitive world global economy, and we're just we're the legacy leaders of the world, and other people are trying to become the new leaders of the world.
And I would think I would not be quite as negative and pessimistic as Derek about the lessons of deficit reduction efforts. I do not think that it can be political suicide, but I don't think it needs to be political suicide. You talked about Clinton before the midterm, but the most significant deficit reduction and balanced budget agreement came after that. His party was amply rewarded. I think also the public mood has clearly changed. Witness the Tea Party. So that's, though I generally inhabit the gloomy world of cynical journalism. That's one area in which I'm not quite as pessimistic as my colleague. Let's go to the.
If we can time deficit reduction to go at the same time as a productivity burst, that's a great once in a generation productivity burst. That's wonderful, and
let's do that.
That'd be great. Let's do that. Yeah, I agree.
Let's go to just pick some folks in the back, so I'm not ignoring them.
Hi, Jim Klumner, Georgetown University. My question is, why do bad things have to unfold over short periods of time? It's why can't bad things unfold over long periods of time? It's very, very fashionable to talk about an impending crisis and perhaps useful for motivating political action, but it took 50 years approximately for the British pound to lose its status as a reserve currency. Why wouldn't our foreign creditors be happy to buy us up piece by piece over several decades?
Isn't the snippy answer to that, how long did it take for people's houses to lose value in the current meltdown? I mean, it would be nice if you knew it could unfold over, you could have long, slow decline instead of
we're a big,
catastrophic,
rich country.
Immediate decline.
We're a big, rich country with a huge natural endowment and a vigorous workforce. Why wouldn't our foreign creditors just be happy to buy us up?
I'm not sure that's a more attractive outcome. No, we don't deal very well with not very visible and slow declines. Unfortunately, as Andy said, it often, we have major reaction when there's a crisis, and unfortunately, almost by definition, you can't predict crises, and you barely can contain them if you're not ready for them. And so, regardless of whether it's a slow decline that is 20 years from now we wake up and we're 50 years behind, or it's a crisis of unknown proportions that spreads quickly, either one of those say we should be preparing for that right now.
I would also say really quickly, I'm sorry, that's also why I think deficit reduction should be thought of sometimes as insurance. Home insurance comes with, whether it's a hurricane or slow mold growth or something. It doesn't matter the time span, you can still collect. And I think it's totally reasonable to think of deficit reduction as insurance against the possibility of either a really quick crisis or a very slow burn crisis, like you said, which is totally possible.
Hi, Douglas Hopkins. I would posit that what has changed is that tax and monetary policy has conspired to make tax avoidance and valuation manipulation far more profitable than productive endeavor. And I'd like to see if you could get a response to that as to what we do with that. But fundamentally, the financial services industry is now reputed to be over a third of the total economy, and yet it is sucking our best and brightest out of the MBA programs in the Ivy League to Wall Street and to Washington.
Jump in?
I mean, it is amazing that we have, investment tax credits for machines and not investment tax credits for people. That we talk about building the capital that actually, deals with, in some ways, reducing employment, but increasing productivity, but not the things that could increase employment, increase productivity as well. So I just feel, we have the wrong incentives. We don't, again, we talk about GDP growth, we don't talk about wage growth, we don't talk about distribution, we talk about, the total macroeconomic numbers, and this is Ann's point, there are people here, right? That's what a society is about, not to see if we can get GDP growth really high, because some people get the top 110% of it, get all of it, or we have a great export product called financial services, that they make their money, by financial engineering and don't create any wealth. So I agree. We have our, if I was building a plan in America, it would not be to see if we could manipulate finances more, to see if some group of people can make more money.
Let's try to get in a few more questions.
My name is Patrick Vaughn. I have a question really to everyone here. One of the greatest acts of civics I've ever seen in the last year was done by the New York Times. They did a federal budget simulator. Can I get a show of hands of how many people have actually tried it? The New York Times federal budget simulator? It's similar, yes.
Yeah.
I've tried the Concord Coalition one. I've tried the CFRB one. You know, they're all good. They're all limited, but they're excellent tools in public discourse. And when I send these around to friends of mine, I get treated like a communist because it does force them to actually make checkbox and make decisions rather than. And I was, is there ways we can just kind of push tools like that into the general public so that people can understand on a real elementary checkbox basis what decisions can be made in the federal budget?
I think all those tools are really helpful, and I think that putting them in the hands of average Americans is a great first step, but it's not the last step. With the Fiscal Commission, again, you saw about 20 really, really smart people who understood the issues come together and disagree reasonably on the answers. And I think it's possible to accept the answer that even with all the information and all the best frames and understanding all of the implications of every possible tweak, you can still disagree strongly and reasonably with what to do. The U.S. budgets are really complicated, pastiche of ideas, and people come to it with totally different mindsets, and it's a great first step. But even if everybody knew the makeup of the budget, you'd still have very strong and passionate disagreements.
But I would just say, and I agree, but everyone should agree we should do something, not nothing, right? And two is everyone, I hope, appreciates after Ann's paper, if not before, and watching what's happened in the States, when we think we're doing nothing, something is actually happening, which is people are getting hurt. Kids are not getting school, seniors are not getting help, people aren't getting drug and alcohol treatment. So while we think we're doing nothing, in fact, people are making adjustments and changes, and something is being done and it's not good. And without a plan, the people that tend to get hurt are the people that can't afford it.
And say one other thing, which is I think those are fabulous tools. They're version 1.0 of a technology, and I can't wait to 2.0 and 3.0 that enable real discussions, real trade-offs, and have citizens engage in this discussion in ways that aren't just soundbite reacting to quick questions on a poll, but actually get people to discuss and debate amongst themselves, that then becomes a force that is much more visible and a pressure to actually do something, because right now they are a helpful tool for those of us who already believe we have a problem, and the challenge is to make it accessible to the broader swath of the population to help get engaged in that issue.
We're going to get in one last question, and then I promise you can ask your question of the next panel.
Good morning.
Thank you.
He actually passed the mic. Allison Johnson. I'm a former consultant for McKinsey & Company. And hi, Lenny. I really would like, Lenny, if you could just dive into that 1% increase in productivity that could actually be the equivalent to addressing the deficit, just to give us the number, how many billions that is. And then if you could also dive into that productivity gain by addressing the challenges of the U.S. government and how it operates. What materially that looks like and how those discussions are going with the OMB and Jeff Zients, who's supposed to be our chief performance officer, looking at these issues of increasing productivity in the U.S. government, and how realistic would that be, although it's probably a short-term resolution to our long-term fiscal crisis. And then, Andy, would you mind diving into the issues of the entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and to what extent you feel people are aware that the privileges that the middle class has gained, both Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the sacrifices that would be necessary for low middle class, upper class people to give up some of those entitlements. In other words, you already have everything you need to retire and take care of your health care, but you still get Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, etc. I mean, would Americans be willing to take on that sacrifice to address the fiscal crisis? Thank you.
So I'll be brief on the first part of yours. So productivity has the same compounding benefit or compounding cost that interest does. A 1.5% increase per year over a decade is around 20%. A 1.5% cost of borrowing, that's interest expense every year, compounded over a decade, is 20%. Which one of those would you rather have? And so that's the basic math of what I was describing. That doesn't happen. It is like interest. It grows on you and compounds over time. So you're not going to see it in 1 year, but over a decade you could see a big change. Is this going to be an attention item, and does the OMB care about it? Does the GAO care about it? No question. The reports that Ruth was mentioning are a start of that conversation. But the fact that it takes the GAO a big report to get anybody to understand that we spend $18 billion in redundant programs on job retraining every year in the country is part of the problem. That needs to be very transparent, and we need to talk about what's working and invest in those and disinvest in what's not working.
And I think Social Security is a very different issue than health care, because it's, again, I keep liking to say it's a pension plan that's out of balance. Many of us have dealt with pension plans out of balance, and there are lots of different things you can do, and clearly means testing, so to speak, lifting caps, including all forms of income. There are many different things that can be done to bring it into balance, much more easily than I happen to not be a person who believes in raising the age, but that's just because I think there's a lot of other things we can do first before we think about those kind of things. I think healthcare is just a fundamentally major different problem, because we have a system that's just beginning to even think about productivity, and I think the Healthcare Act's got it on its way with technology and a lot of other efforts. But and I do believe we should mean test things, and as a general principle, I actually just think there are answers to the healthcare problem. You can get, we talked about this productivity rush. There is a cost reduction rush called France, Germany, England, Switzerland. You can have Newt Gingrich's Switzerland or someone else's Canada, but there is a productivity rush by being late adapters to other things that have worked.
Just really quickly to close, you talked about the character or briefly alluded to the character of the U.S. government and what sort of it's all about. I was thinking a while ago about how in the last 40 years we've sort of pumped the brakes on productivity-enhancing investments in infrastructure and research and development technology, while healthcare and income security have grown much faster than the general economy. And I mean, to a certain extent, that makes it sound pejorative, but this makes sense. We're an aging, rich country, and like an aging, rich couple, we've shifted our spending away from the kids' clothes and tuition towards things that preserve our quality of living. That's a choice that we've all made together. But I think it's also important to remember what this country was doing in the 1950s and 1960s. We were investing heavily in infrastructure. We were investing heavily in education, research and development, technology and innovation. And so at the same time, while we think about changing the makeup of the government, changing taxes and spending, we should also think a little bit about sharpening that edge that we had in the 1950s and 60s.
Great. Well, thank you all three for a terrific and thoughtful panel.